During a routine charity visit, three young faces in an orphanage mirror a powerful man's own. Within the walls of both poverty and privilege, DNA results weave a tale that challenges everything he thought he knew. Between coincidence and destiny lies a truth that will forever change how a wealthy family defines itself. As science confirms the impossible, the meaning of legacy takes new shape. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of St. Jude's Orphanage. Arthur Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries, felt a prickle of unease despite his tailored suit and practiced composure. He'd made countless charity visits, but this one felt different. The three children, Liam, Maya, and Chloe, seated before him, were unnervingly familiar. Their dark hair, the sharp angles of their cheekbones, even the way Liam nervously tucked a stray strand behind his ear. It all echoed a ghost within Arthur's own memory, a ghost he'd spent a lifetime burying. Liam, the eldest, looked up with startlingly familiar eyes, mirroring the gray-blue depths Arthur saw in the glass every morning. A tremor of something akin to fear, a feeling utterly foreign to the controlled Arthur, ran through him. He forced a smile, a practiced mask slipping just a fraction. "So, Liam," he began, his voice betraying a slightly higher pitch than usual. "What are you reading?" Liam, clutching a worn copy of Treasure Island, mumbled something about pirates. Maya, quiet and observant, watched Arthur with unnerving intensity. Chloe, the youngest, simply stared, her large eyes mirroring the unsettling feeling settling in Arthur's stomach. The air in the small room crackled with an unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement of something profoundly unsettling. The shared gaze between Arthur and Liam lingered, a recognition passing between them, unseen by the others, yet heavy with unspoken weight. The worn wooden chair creaked under Arthur's weight, a small sound that seemed to amplify the silence. The faint scent of dust and old books mingled with the antiseptic, creating a strange, unsettling aroma. He cleared his throat, the sound barely audible above the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. He had to leave to escape this unsettling feeling, this nagging sense of kinship. But the faint image of a shared birthmark, a tiny crescent moon behind Liam's ear, flickered in his mind's eye, clinging to the edges of his carefully constructed reality. He knew deep down that this was just the beginning. The drive back to his sprawling estate felt longer than usual. The sterile scent of the orphanage clung to Arthur like a second skin, a stark contrast to the leather and polished wood of his limousine. He stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color, yet seeing none of it. Liam's eyes, haunted and wise beyond his years, burned in his mind. The unsettling resemblance wasn't just physical. There was a shared vulnerability, a quiet strength in those three children that mirrored a hidden part of himself, a part he'd long since suppressed. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. The birthmark, a tiny crescent moon, identical to one he vaguely remembered from his own childhood. A memory shrouded in the fog of his repressed past gnawed at his composure. He dismissed it as coincidence, but the unsettling feeling lingered, a persistent hum beneath the surface of his meticulously crafted life. Eleanor, his wife, awaited him at home, a vision of elegant composure in a silk robe. He offered a strained smile, a practiced performance designed to mask the turmoil raging within. "Long day," he murmured, avoiding her eyes. "Darling, you seem disturbed," Eleanor observed, her voice soft but perceptive. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He flinched, the touch momentarily jarring. The intimacy felt foreign, uncomfortable. He pulled away subtly, the action speaking volumes. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass mirroring the chaotic thoughts churning in his head. "Just a difficult visit," he mumbled, his voice tight. The words felt inadequate, hollow even to his own ears. He could feel the chasm widening between them, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken distance that had always existed, a distance now threatened by something far more profound than simple incompatibility. He needed answers, needed to understand the unsettling connection, the impossible possibility that had taken root in his soul. His carefully constructed world, a world built on control and emotional detachment, was teetering on the brink of collapse. The children at St. Jude's weren't just a fleeting encounter. They were a mirror reflecting a hidden, painful truth he had spent a lifetime trying to escape. The silence hung heavy in the air, the unspoken questions a tangible presence in the opulent room. He knew the next step, the one he'd been unconsciously avoiding, was a descent into the unknown, a confrontation with a past he thought he'd left behind. He felt a cold wave of dread, yet a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps, or a burgeoning sense of responsibility. The plush leather of his car seat felt alien against his skin. Arthur stared out the rain-streaked window, the city lights a blurry kaleidoscope of indifference. He replayed Liam's quiet gaze, the sharp intelligence in those eyes that echoed a forgotten part of himself. The crescent moon birthmark, a mirror image of his own, pulsed in his memory, a persistent throb against the dull ache in his chest. Coincidence? He'd clung to that word like a life raft, but its flimsy support was cracking under the weight of his growing unease. Eleanor's presence, usually a soothing balm, felt like an accusation. The scent of her perfume, usually a familiar comfort, now seemed sharp, almost suffocating. He watched her, her elegant posture a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. "Difficult day," he repeated, his voice flat, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "More than difficult, Arthur," she replied, her voice low, laced with concern that bordered on suspicion. Her hand reached for his, but he flinched again, the gesture betraying the deep-seated fear that clawed at him. The touch, once a symbol of their connection, now felt like a violation. He recoiled, silently pleading for space, for time to process the impossible weight of the day. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in the glass, mirroring the confusion in his own soul. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, a constant reminder of time's relentless march. He needed answers, not for himself, not just for the fragile piece of his meticulously constructed life, but for those 3 children, for the haunting echoes of his past that mirrored their own vulnerable gaze. The decision solidified, a chilling certainty that settled in his gut. He would contact Dr. Albright, the geneticist. The test, clandestine and risky, felt unavoidable. The fear was palpable, but so too was a nascent sense of responsibility, a feeling so foreign it both frightened and strangely comforted him. He had to know. He had to face the truth, however terrifying it might be. The meticulously ordered world he had built was collapsing, but in its ruins, something else might emerge, something far more profound than he could have ever imagined. The antiseptic smell of the lab clung to Arthur like a second skin. Dr. Albright, a woman whose face held the weariness of countless secrets, handed him the results. He didn't need to look. The tremor in her hand spoke volumes. The crisp white paper felt brittle against his trembling fingers. He unfolded it slowly, each crease a crack in the carefully constructed facade of his life. The words blurred, swimming in a tide of rising panic. He swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat mirroring the desert of his soul. Eleanor's absence was a physical presence in the opulent emptiness of their home. The silence stretched, an unbearable chasm between him and the life he knew. He moved through the rooms, the polished surfaces reflecting his own haunted face. The soft glow of the evening sun cast long shadows, exaggerating the cavernous spaces. Each object, once a symbol of success, now felt like a mocking reminder of his carefully built, yet crumbling world. He found himself drawn to Liam's worn teddy bear, a gift from the orphanage. The faded fur, the single button eye, spoke of a life lived in quiet resilience. He picked it up, the worn fabric a stark contrast to the silk sheets on his bed. A single tear traced a path through the lines etched on his face, a silent acknowledgement of a profound change in his life's trajectory. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the small bear clutched in his hand, the weight of it surprisingly comforting. The phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the silence, jarring him back to the stark reality of his situation. It was his lawyer, his voice a strained whisper on the other end, already whispering of legal battles and public relations nightmares. Arthur listened, the words washing over him like cold waves. He felt a strange calm settle over him, a chilling acceptance of the inevitable. He wasn't just facing a crisis. His entire life, his meticulously constructed identity, was about to be dismantled. But alongside the fear, a strange new feeling emerged, a fragile hope, a spark of responsibility. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about 3 children, about a past that had finally caught up to him, but one that might bring about a new future, a future that might encompass love and forgiveness. The fear was still there, sharp and chilling. But beneath it, like a nascent sun breaking through the clouds, lay the quiet promise of something new, something far more profound than wealth or power. He needed answers. He needed to face the storm. He needed to prepare. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur Blackwood felt a flicker of hope. The orphanage smelled of stale milk and disinfectant, a peculiar blend clinging to the rough-hewn wooden floors. Sunlight, fractured by grime-coated windows, illuminated motes of dust dancing in the air. Liam, Maya, and Chloe huddled together, their eyes wide and curious as Arthur entered. The children's clothes were patched and worn, yet their faces held an uncanny resilience. Arthur felt a tightening in his chest, a visceral reaction he couldn't ignore. He forced a smile, a practiced gesture that felt brittle and false. "Hello," he managed, his voice a little too loud in the quiet space. Liam, the boldest of the 3, stepped forward. "Are you here to take us away?" His small hand, dirty and calloused, gripped a worn wooden toy car. The question hung in the air, a stark reminder of their vulnerable situation. Arthur stammered, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. No, of course not. I'm just visiting." He glanced at Maya, her eyes mirroring a depth of sadness that struck a deep chord within him. Chloe, the quietest, clung to Maya's arm, her knuckles white. Sister Agnes, a woman whose face bore the weight of years spent caring for forgotten children, smiled gently. "These 3 are quite remarkable, Mr. Blackwood. They stick together through thick and thin." He nodded, his gaze lingering on the trio. He saw in their faces a reflection of his own lost childhood, a shared vulnerability that both terrified and compelled him. The faint scent of wood smoke and something indefinably sweet, perhaps dried fruit, mingled with the sterile air, a poignant contrast he found strangely moving. The rough textures of the orphanage walls seemed to press in on him, a stark reminder of the opulent emptiness of his own home. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his life was about to change irrevocably. The seed of doubt, planted by their resemblance, was now taking root, growing into a terrifying, yet strangely compelling truth. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the gentle hum of the ancient refrigerator in the corner. He felt a wave of nausea, a physical manifestation of the internal turmoil he desperately tried to suppress. The weight of Sister Agnes's words hung heavy in the air. Remarkable, she'd called them, and Arthur felt the truth of it settle in his gut like a stone. He watched Liam, Maya, and Chloe, their shared vulnerability a stark contrast to the polished surfaces of his own life. The worn wooden floorboards creaked under his expensive shoes, a jarring dissonance. He felt a strange pull towards them, an inexplicable kinship that both frightened and fascinated him. The faint scent of wood smoke, so different from the perfumed air of his mansion, suddenly felt comforting. He knelt, the movement awkward and unfamiliar. Liam's gaze, intense and questioning, held his. "What's your name?" Arthur asked, his voice softer than he intended. Liam, clutching his toy car tighter, answered in a low voice, "Liam." Maya and Chloe remained silent, observing him with a cautious curiosity that tugged at something deep within him. "You remind me of someone," he murmured, the words tumbling out, unplanned, a confession whispered to himself as much as to them. The children exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Arthur felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to retreat, to erase this unsettling encounter. But something held him captive, their resemblance. The haunting echo of his own forgotten childhood. The burgeoning sense of responsibility that threatened to unravel his carefully constructed world. He stood up, the sudden movement unsettling the fragile calm. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of a connection yet to be acknowledged. He looked at Sister Agnes, her kind eyes reflecting both compassion and understanding. He saw a glimmer of hope, a possibility of healing in her gentle gaze. He saw, in the faint lines etched around her eyes and mouth, the silent narrative of years spent tending to the forgotten souls within these walls. He needed answers. He needed to unravel the mystery that bound him to these 3 children. The seed of doubt was now a sapling, its roots growing deeper, stretching towards a truth that could shatter his life, but might also bring a long-awaited healing. The decision, the terrible and magnificent leap of faith, solidified in his mind. He had to know. The orphanage's worn wooden staircase groaned under Arthur's weight, each step a reluctant descent back into the unsettling reality of the 3 children. The air, thick with the scent of disinfectant and something faintly sweet, clung to his expensive suit like a second skin, jarringly at odds with the lingering wood smoke aroma. He found them in the common room, huddled together, Liam engrossed in a battered toy car, Maya sketching furiously in a worn notebook, Chloe quietly observing them both. The flickering gaslight cast long shadows, emphasizing the fragility of their forms. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the hushed space. Liam looked up, his eyes, the same startling blue as Arthur's, widening slightly. Maya and Chloe followed suit, their gazes cautious but not unkind. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a heavy beat against the backdrop of unspoken questions. I was thinking about what I said earlier, Arthur began, his voice a low rumble, unfamiliar even to his own ears. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He watched Liam meticulously turn the toy car over in his hands, its paint chipped and faded. The boy's stillness mirrored Arthur's own internal struggle. The urge to flee, to return to the sterile perfection of his mansion, was almost overwhelming. About the resemblance, he continued, his gaze shifting from Liam to Maya, then to Chloe. He noted the slight tremor in Maya's hand as she continued to draw. Chloe, the quietest of the 3, met his eyes, her expression unreadable. He felt a sudden, unexpected wave of empathy wash over him, a stark contrast to the usual emotional detachment that had defined his life. Liam looked up again, his gaze unwavering. "You said we reminded you of someone," he stated, his voice small but clear. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Arthur swallowed, a lump forming in his throat. He could feel the weight of his own past, his own abandonment pressing down on him. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart felt increasingly fragile. He knelt again, the movement less awkward this time, more deliberate. I want to know more about you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He reached out, hesitantly at first, then with a newfound resolve, and gently touched Liam's arm. The boy didn't flinch. In that brief moment of contact, Arthur felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced before, a connection, a nascent bond that defied logic and reason. The seed of doubt had blossomed into a fragile but undeniable truth. He needed answers, and he was ready to face them. The flickering gaslight cast long shadows, painting the orphanage's worn walls in shades of amber and gray. The scent of wood smoke, mingling with the faint sweetness of overripe apples, hung heavy in the air. Liam, Maya, and Chloe sat huddled together, a fragile island of warmth in the vast, echoing space. Arthur watched them, his expensive suit feeling like a suffocating cage. He felt the familiar pull of his carefully constructed emotional distance, yet a countercurrent, something raw and unsettling, tugged at him. He cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly loud in the quiet room. Liam looked up, his eyes, those startling, familiar blue eyes, widening slightly. Maya and Chloe mirrored his apprehension. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. The ticking grandfather clock, a relentless metronome marking the passage of an agonizing time. I wanted to apologize, Arthur began, his voice rough, the words catching in his throat. The apology felt inadequate, hollow, even to his own ears. He saw Maya subtly grip the worn cover of her sketchbook, her knuckles white. Chloe's gaze remained steady, unwavering, an unnerving mixture of curiosity and caution. Liam, ever the pragmatist, spoke first. Apologize for what? His voice was small, but his tone held a surprising strength. Arthur hesitated. He hadn't anticipated this resilience, this quiet defiance in the face of his own awkwardness. The chasm between his world of privilege and theirs seemed unbridgeable. Yet the resemblance, the inexplicable connection, gnawed at him. For intruding, he finally managed. The words a clumsy attempt to bridge the gulf between them. He knelt, the movement clumsy, awkward. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, a sound that mirrored the tremor in his own hands. I need to ask you some questions. His gaze shifted from one child to the next, each face a mirror reflecting a part of himself he had long suppressed. The weight of his own past, the unspoken abandonment, pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart felt alarmingly fragile. The silence lingered, a heavy blanket woven from uncertainty and apprehension. He felt a profound sense of unease, a fear that went beyond the simple discomfort of vulnerability. It was the fear of shattering his carefully constructed life, of facing a truth he wasn't sure he could bear. Yet he knew with a growing certainty he had to try. The orphanage matron, a woman whose face held the etched map of a life lived hard, offered Arthur tea. The chipped porcelain warmed his hands, a stark contrast to the icy grip of apprehension tightening his chest. He watched Liam, tracing the intricate carvings on a small wooden bird, a crudely fashioned thing, yet imbued with a quiet dignity. It was a detail, insignificant in itself, yet it resonated with Arthur. A tangible link to the child, a shared space beyond the gulf of their disparate worlds. It's a beautiful bird, Arthur said, his voice rougher than intended. Liam looked up, his gaze direct and unflinching. My brother made it, he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Before, he trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. A shadow crossed his face, a fleeting glimpse of a sadness that mirrored the ache in Arthur's own heart. Maya, ever watchful, her eyes mirroring the deep brown of her hair, spoke. He loved to carve, she said, her voice tinged with a wistful nostalgia. He was good. Chloe, the youngest, remained silent, her fingers nervously twisting a faded ribbon. The silence stretched, filled only with the gentle ticking of a wall clock, each tick a hammer blow against Arthur's carefully constructed composure. The shared birthmark, a faint constellation of moles nestled just beneath Liam's ear, haunted him. It was the same mark, subtly hidden beneath his own unruly hair, a secret shared across a chasm of privilege and poverty, a physical manifestation of a bond he hadn't known existed. The matron cleared her throat, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. They've been through a lot, she said, her voice laced with weariness, yet also with a quiet strength. But they're resilient, strong. Her words hung in the air, a quiet affirmation of the children's inherent fortitude, a stark contrast to Arthur's own carefully cultivated detachment. He felt the first fragile tendrils of empathy, a disquieting warmth thawing the icy grip of his self-imposed solitude. The tea grew cold in his hands, yet the warmth it offered seemed inconsequential to the burgeoning heat rising within him. A heat born not of anger or fear, but of something far more unsettling. A dawning recognition, a sense of responsibility that both thrilled and terrified him. The possibility, however improbable, of a connection, of a family he had never known, loomed large, casting a long shadow over his life. He knew then, with chilling certainty, that he couldn't ignore the whispers of his heart. The quest for answers had begun. The chipped paint of the orphanage's hallway felt rough beneath Arthur's fingertips as he walked, the silence amplifying the frantic rhythm of his pulse. He'd left the matron's office with a swirling vortex of emotions. Unease, a nascent fear, and a strange, unsettling curiosity. The faint scent of disinfectant and old wood clung to the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed luxury of his own home. He paused outside Liam's room, the worn wooden door slightly ajar. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. The image of the carved wooden bird, so simple yet imbued with a profound sadness, flashed in his mind. He'd seen a similar carving on his grandfather's desk, a piece he'd always dismissed as an antique, now imbued with a chilling significance. He pushed the door open a crack. Liam sat on a small cot, his head bowed, his slender shoulders trembling. The room was small, sparsely furnished, yet somehow it felt intimate. A single shaft of afternoon sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The child's breathing was shallow, ragged. Arthur felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him, a sensation both unfamiliar and intensely powerful. "Liam!" Arthur's voice was barely a whisper. The boy flinched, then slowly looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. He wiped at them with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of dirt on his cheek. "Mr. Blackwood?" His voice was weak, hesitant. Arthur stepped inside, the worn floorboards creaking beneath his expensive shoes. He knelt, bringing himself down to the boy's level. The act felt both awkward and strangely necessary. I just wanted to see if you were all right," Arthur mumbled, his own throat suddenly tight. The words felt inadequate, clumsy, failing to convey the turmoil of emotions warring within him. Liam nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. Silence descended, heavy and thick, broken only by the faint sound of a distant cough. Arthur saw a small, worn book lying open beside the cot. A children's story, its pages dog-eared and tattered. A pang of something akin to sympathy resonated deep in his chest, a sentiment as unexpected as it was profound. He reached out, his hand hovering over the book, a silent acknowledgement of the boy's vulnerability. The quest for answers had begun, but now a new, more compelling purpose began to take root. A sense of responsibility to this child, to these three children whose lives mirrored his own in ways he had only just begun to grasp. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, as heavy as the silence in the small, dimly lit room. The worn wooden bird, identical to the one on his grandfather's desk, felt heavy in Arthur's hand. He'd found it tucked into Chloe's small, worn satchel, a simple carving, yet it pulsed with a strange, unsettling significance. The orphanage's muted scent of disinfectant and old wood clung to him, a stark contrast to the expensive cologne he usually wore. He stared at the bird, the rough texture a counterpoint to the smoothness of his own perfectly manicured hand. Doubt, a seed planted earlier, was now a burgeoning weed threatening to unravel the carefully constructed order of his life. He returned to Liam's room, the boy's quiet sobs barely audible. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty floor. Liam looked up, his eyes swollen, his small face streaked with tears. Arthur sat beside him, the awkwardness of the situation palpable. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "The bird," Arthur began, his voice rough, unfamiliar even to his own ears. I have one just like it." Liam's gaze flickered up, a spark of curiosity momentarily eclipsing his sadness. "Really?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Arthur nodded, feeling a strange vulnerability he hadn't experienced in years. "It was my grandfather's, a very old piece." He hesitated, then added, It feels important." The words hung in the air, fragile and tentative. Liam reached out a small, dirt-stained hand, tracing the lines of the carving. "It's pretty," he murmured, his voice barely a breath. He looked up at Arthur, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. Do you think it means something?" The question hung in the air, unspoken yet intensely felt. Arthur felt the weight of his own unanswered questions pressing down on him. The unsettling resemblance, the shared birthmark, the identical carving. The coincidences were piling up, forming a mountain of doubt that threatened to topple his meticulously crafted world. The quiet desperation in the boy's eyes mirrored a similar, long-suppressed emotion within himself. He knew then, with a chilling certainty, that this was more than just a coincidence. This was something far deeper, far more profound. The quest for answers was no longer just a curiosity. It was a desperate need, fueled by a growing sense of responsibility he couldn't ignore. The game had changed, and he was about to play. The orphanage's stark fluorescent lights hummed, a counterpoint to the hushed whispers of the children settling down for the night. Arthur, back in his chauffeured car, felt the familiar chill of his detachment begin to crack. The worn wooden bird, a miniature replica of his grandfather's prized possession, sat heavy in his pocket. The rough grain felt alien against his smooth skin, a tactile reminder of the chasm separating his world from Liam's. He replayed Liam's question, the boy's fragile hope clinging to the worn wood. Do you think it means something? The question echoed the turmoil within Arthur himself. The shared birthmark, a faint crescent moon nestled just below the collarbone, was undeniable. The identical bird, a coincidence? He refused to believe it. Logic, his usual shield, crumbled. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window. His perfectly ordered life, the carefully constructed image of success, felt fragile, threatened by the raw, unfiltered emotions swirling within him. His usual calm was shattered, replaced by an unsettling mix of fear, fascination, and a nascent sense of responsibility. He felt a strange pull, a yearning to understand, to connect with the three children, a connection he desperately tried to deny. He thought of Eleanor, his wife, her serene beauty a mask concealing he didn't know what. How could he shatter the carefully built foundation of their marriage? The thought filled him with a cold dread, a stark counterpoint to the warmth, however hesitant, he felt stirring within him towards the children. The weight of his secret pressed upon him, a heavy cloak in the luxurious silence of the limousine. The car pulled up to his opulent mansion, the sharp contrast between his world and the orphanage a painful reminder of the widening gulf he sensed. He got out, the cool night air a slight relief from the stifling emotions trapped within him. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, he couldn't ignore this anymore. The quest for answers had begun. The potential consequences, both personal and professional, loomed, but the unsettling pull towards the truth was stronger than his fear. The game had indeed changed, and he was ready to play. The mahogany desk in Arthur's study felt colder than usual. The city lights, usually a comforting backdrop to his late-night work, felt alien, harsh against the shadows clinging to the corners of the room. He sat, the DNA test requisition form clutched in his hand, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the tremor in his fingers. Eleanor's soft snores drifted from the bedroom, a fragile lullaby in the otherwise silent house. The silence was a suffocating blanket, heavy with the weight of his secret. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. Liam's hopeful face, Maya's shy smile, Chloe's fierce intelligence, all three flashed before his eyes. A kaleidoscope of emotions he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. The worn wooden bird, a miniature replica of his grandfather's prized possession, lay on his desk, a silent witness to his turmoil. He picked it up, turning it over and over in his hand, the smooth, polished wood a stark counterpoint to the rough, almost frantic beating of his heart. It was identical to the one Liam held so tightly, a shared relic bridging the vast chasm separating their worlds. Was it merely a coincidence, a cruel trick of fate, or something far more profound? A wave of nausea washed over him. The potential consequences were dizzying. The scandal, the upheaval to his carefully constructed life, the hurt he would inflict on Eleanor, the weight of it all threatened to crush him. Yet, the thought of not knowing, of ignoring the insistent pull towards the truth, felt far worse. He thought of his own childhood, the icy silence, the gnawing emptiness, the abandonment, a wound that had festered, shaping him into the emotionally detached man he was. Could he bear to confront the possibility that he had unwittingly inflicted the same pain on 3 innocent children? The question hung in the air, unspoken, yet heavy with profound implications. He finally placed the requisition form into a pre-addressed, unmarked envelope. A single tear escaped his eye, hot against his skin, a testament to the years of suppressed emotion finally cracking the surface of his carefully constructed facade. The decision was made. The quest for answers, fraught with fear and uncertainty, had begun. The cost, he knew, would be immeasurable, but the possibility of truth, however painful, felt infinitely more compelling than the suffocating certainty of his self-imposed isolation. He rose, his shadow stretching long and distorted in the dim light, and walked towards the door, leaving the wooden bird on his desk, a poignant symbol of the journey that lay ahead. The sterile white walls of the clinic felt colder than the marble floors of Arthur's penthouse. He sat, the waiting room buzzing with a low hum of hushed anxieties, a stark contrast to the deafening silence of his own mind. He shifted uncomfortably, the stiff chair digging into his expensive suit. The faint scent of antiseptic battled with the lingering aroma of his expensive cologne, a jarring juxtaposition mirroring the turmoil within him. He checked his watch, the polished steel gleaming under the fluorescent lights, each tick echoing the frantic rhythm of his heart. A nurse called his name, her voice a gentle interruption to the internal monologue that had been raging since he'd sent the sample. He followed her down a sterile corridor, the rhythmic squeak of her shoes against the polished floor a counterpoint to the pounding in his ears. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat a physical manifestation of his apprehension. The doctor's office was small, impersonal, yet the weight of expectation felt monumental. "Mr. Blackwood?" the doctor began, his voice calm, professional, yet laced with a subtle undercurrent of something else, something that made Arthur's stomach clench. "The results are conclusive." He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle, to sink into Arthur's very core. "The DNA, it matches." A wave of nausea rolled over Arthur. The room swam, the crisp white walls blurring at the edges. He gripped the arms of the chair, knuckles white, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. He'd anticipated this, prepared for it in some abstract way. Yet the stark reality of the words, their undeniable finality, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, only stared at the doctor, his mind reeling. "All 3 children," the doctor continued, his voice soft yet firm. "Liam, Maya, and Chloe. They are your biological children." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Arthur's ragged breathing. The truth, stark and undeniable, hung heavy in the air, suffocating him. The meticulously crafted life he'd built, the carefully constructed walls around his heart, were crumbling before his eyes. His carefully cultivated emotional detachment, a shield forged in the fires of his own abandonment, had finally been breached. The implications were staggering, terrifying, and yet, a strange, unexpected seed of something else took root. A terrifying, exhilarating possibility of connection, of belonging. A hope as fragile as it was powerful. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, a burden, yet also a strange, unexpected solace. The long journey home was a blur, the city lights indistinguishable from the storm raging within. The car ride was a blur. The city lights, usually a dazzling spectacle, were mere streaks of color through a veil of tears. Arthur gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles bone-white against the expensive leather. The scent of his own cologne, usually a comforting familiarity, now felt suffocating, a reminder of the meticulously constructed facade he'd worn for so long. He replayed the doctor's words in his head, each syllable a hammer blow against the walls of his carefully built emotional fortress. He pulled into the driveway of his sprawling mansion, the enormity of it suddenly feeling oppressive. The usually comforting familiarity of his home now felt like a cage. He entered the silent, opulent house, the polished floors reflecting his anguished face back at him. Eleanor, his wife, was in the library, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating her perfectly composed figure. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Arthur," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. He couldn't speak, the words catching in his throat. He simply sank into a chair, the plush velvet doing little to cushion the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He watched as Eleanor rose, her grace almost unsettling in its contrast to the turmoil inside him. She approached him slowly, her eyes searching his, a mixture of concern and something else. "Suspicion? I need to tell you something," he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. Eleanor's gaze held his, unwavering, her usual composure beginning to crack. He saw a flicker of fear, of uncertainty, mirroring his own. The carefully constructed image of their perfect life, a life he'd always believed was built on a foundation of mutual love and understanding, now crumbled under the weight of his confession. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, the anticipation palpable. The unspoken question hung between them, thick and suffocating. What would this mean for them? For their life together? The future stretched before them, uncertain, shrouded in a fog of fear and apprehension. He had to tell her. He had to, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. The weight of this truth was almost too great to bear alone. The cold, sterile environment of the lab contrasted sharply with the turmoil raging inside Arthur. He sat, clutching a worn leather briefcase, the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco a faint comfort in the face of the impending revelation. The doctor's quiet footsteps echoed in the hushed room, the silence amplifying the frantic beat of Arthur's heart. He felt a tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of his anxiety. "Mr. Blackwood," the doctor began, his voice measured. "The results are conclusive." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Arthur's breath hitched. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. The doctor placed a file on the desk, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the trembling of Arthur's hands as he reached for it. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the stark black and white print. His breath caught in his throat. The stark, undeniable truth slammed into him, a physical blow. A wave of nausea washed over him, a bitter taste coating his tongue. He closed his eyes, the image of the three children's faces, their innocent eyes mirroring his own, burned into his mind. He looked up, his eyes mirroring the turmoil within. "So it's true," he whispered, the words barely audible above the thump-thump-thump of his racing heart. The doctor nodded, his expression somber. "The DNA evidence confirms a biological relationship." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Arthur's carefully constructed world was crumbling, the perfect facade shattering into a million pieces. The weight of this truth was crushing, unbearable. He felt a deep, icy dread settle in his stomach, a chilling premonition of the upheaval to come. The comfortable numbness he'd cultivated for so many years was gone, replaced by a raw, visceral fear. His life, his family, his entire identity. Everything was about to change irrevocably. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the overwhelming smell of impending disaster. He felt a tremor in his hands as he rose from his chair. This was not just a scientific fact. It was a seismic shift in the landscape of his existence. The sterile white of the lab walls seemed to press in on Arthur. He stared at the report, the crisp black lettering blurring through a film of unshed tears. The air hung heavy, thick with the unspoken. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, a constricting vice around his heart. The doctor's words, "a biological relationship," echoed in the silent room, a cruel mockery of the carefully constructed calm of his life. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, the silver strands a stark reminder of the years he'd spent avoiding this very moment. The scent of antiseptic fought with the phantom smell of wood smoke and damp earth, memories of a childhood he'd buried deep. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down his cheek, a testament to the dam finally breaking. He thought of Eleanor, her elegant composure, the fragile perfection of their life together. The image of her face, usually serene, twisted in anguish, flashed before his eyes. He imagined the inevitable confrontation, the accusations, the pain. The thought was a physical blow, sending a jolt of fear through him. He picked up the phone, his hand shaking so violently that he nearly dropped it. The cool plastic felt alien against his clammy skin. He dialed his home number, the familiar digits suddenly feeling strange and unfamiliar, a symbol of the life he was about to shatter. The ringing tone was a relentless hammer against his already frayed nerves. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the conversation to come, a conversation that would change everything. He was a man of control, of carefully constructed plans, yet here he was utterly and completely adrift. The weight of his secret, once a manageable burden, now threatened to crush him completely. The phone rang, each shrill peal a tiny hammer blow against Arthur's already fractured composure. He stared at the mahogany desk, the polished surface reflecting his own ashen face. The opulent office, usually a sanctuary of control, felt like a suffocating cage. He'd spent his life building this empire, brick by painstaking brick, yet the foundation felt hollow now, crumbling beneath the weight of his secret. Eleanor's voice, usually a melodic counterpoint to his own controlled tones, was tight with barely suppressed anxiety. "Arthur, is everything all right? You haven't been yourself all week." He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and unfamiliar. I need to talk to you. It's important." The words felt heavy, each syllable a lead weight dragging him down. "What is it, Arthur? Please, just tell me." Her voice, though strained, held a thread of unwavering love that pierced through his carefully constructed defenses. He pictured her, waiting by the phone, her elegant form radiating an anxious energy. The image both comforted and terrified him. He hesitated, the silence stretching between them, taut with unspoken dread. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his fear. I received some test results today," he began, his voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, fragile and incomplete. He could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, piecing together fragments of his unusual behavior, the late nights, the absent stares. "What kind of test results?" Her voice was sharper now, laced with apprehension. He could almost feel the chill of fear radiating from the phone. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the storm that was about to break. "DNA results," he finally whispered, the words escaping like a condemned breath. The silence that followed was deafening, more potent than any storm. He could practically feel the seismic shift, the earth moving beneath him, the careful edifice of his life starting to crumble. The expensive artwork on his walls seemed to blur, replaced by the haunting images of Liam, Maya, and Chloe's faces, 3 innocent mirrors reflecting a truth he had desperately tried to ignore. The weight of his secret, once a manageable burden, had become an unbearable avalanche. He waited, bracing himself for the fallout, for the inevitable implosion of his carefully constructed world. The sterile white of the envelope felt cold against Arthur's trembling fingers. He sat hunched in his leather armchair, the scent of aged leather a faint comfort against the rising tide of dread. Outside, the city thrummed with its usual frenetic energy, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence within his study. He'd spent the week replaying the children's faces in his mind: Liam's mischievous grin, Maya's quiet intensity, Chloe's shy smile, 3 miniature reflections of himself, staring back from the depths of a poverty he'd never known. He tore open the envelope, the crisp sound oddly loud in the stillness. The stark black print of the report blurred through his unshed tears. He read the words again, and again, each repetition a hammer blow to his already shattered composure. The confirmation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. 99.99% probability of paternity. 3 children, his children. A wave of nausea washed over him, leaving him weak and breathless. He sank back into the chair, the plush leather offering little solace. His meticulously constructed world, built on ambition and control, crumbled around him. The carefully cultivated image of success, the enviable life he'd built with Eleanor, felt like a fragile house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest touch. His childhood flashed before his eyes, a bleak landscape of neglect and abandonment. The echoes of his own unspoken longing for a father's love resonated in the silence, a painful counterpoint to the overwhelming reality of his own fatherhood. He'd run from that pain, built walls around his heart, yet here it was, staring him in the face, amplified threefold. A sob escaped him, a raw, guttural sound that ripped through his carefully maintained composure. He buried his face in his hands, the cool leather a stark contrast to the burning shame and guilt that consumed him. He'd spent his life avoiding vulnerability, yet here he was utterly exposed, his carefully crafted facade reduced to rubble. The weight of his secret, once manageable, had become an unbearable burden. The phone rang again, a jarring intrusion into his private agony. He knew it was Eleanor. He didn't answer. The silence, for now, was a preferable torment. The city lights blurred through Arthur's tear-filled eyes. Rain lashed against the window panes, mirroring the storm raging within him. The DNA results lay discarded on his desk, a stark, clinical testament to a truth he couldn't comprehend. He hadn't eaten in days. The stale air hung heavy with the scent of old books and despair. He felt adrift, a ship lost at sea, tossed about by waves of guilt and disbelief. His phone buzzed again, Eleanor. He ignored it, the silence a preferable cruelty to facing her judgment. He imagined her face, the perfect composure he'd always admired, now likely fractured by the impossible revelation. His carefully constructed world, built on lies of omission, was crumbling. The mahogany of his desk felt cold and unforgiving beneath his trembling hand. He reached for a half-empty glass of amber liquid, the liquor burning a path through his numb throat. A memory surfaced, a shard of his own neglected childhood. A cold, echoing room, the distant sound of a slammed door, the persistent ache of loneliness. He saw himself, a small boy huddled in a corner, clutching a worn teddy bear, a silent testament to his desperate need for connection. The image blurred, merging with the faces of Liam, Maya, and Chloe, their vulnerability a painful echo of his own past. He rose, pacing the room, the Persian rug a muted comfort beneath his feet. He had to tell them. He had to face his children. His children. The word felt alien, yet strangely comforting. A reluctant warmth, a nascent flicker of paternal instinct, sparked within the icy landscape of his heart. He imagined their small hands, their innocent eyes, their fragile need for a father's love. He had denied them that love unwittingly, yet the weight of his responsibility pressed down upon him, a crushing yet strangely liberating burden. He picked up the phone, his hand shaking. This was the first step, the hardest step, but a step nonetheless. He punched in Eleanor's number, the dial tone a sharp counterpoint to the turmoil in his soul. "Eleanor," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to talk." The sterile white of the lab report glared back at Arthur. 3 names, 3 identical lines of genetic code. The air in his opulent study, usually scented with expensive sandalwood, felt thin, stale. He reread the conclusion, 99.99% probability of paternity. The words swam before his eyes, blurring into an indistinguishable mass. His meticulously ordered world, a testament to his control, had been shattered. Not by some external force, but by the stark, undeniable truth staring back from the page. He felt a wave of nausea, a cold sweat slicking his palms. He pushed away from the desk, the polished mahogany cool against his skin. He needed air. He stumbled to the French doors, throwing them open. The crisp night air, scented with damp earth and distant city lights, did little to soothe the turmoil within. He stared out at his meticulously manicured garden, a landscape as carefully constructed as his life. Now it felt like a gilded cage. He saw the reflection of his pale, haunted face in the glass, the lines of strain etched deep around his eyes. He looked older, weathered beyond his years. The man in the reflection was a stranger, a shell of the composed CEO he presented to the world. The phone rang, jarring him from his reverie. It was Eleanor. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver. He couldn't face her yet, not until he processed the tidal wave of emotions threatening to engulf him: guilt, fear, a nascent, unsettling sense of responsibility. He let it ring, the silence amplifying the deafening roar in his ears. The image of Liam's shy smile, Maya's fiery spirit, Chloe's quiet grace flashed through his mind. Their faces, eerily mirroring his own youthful self, felt imprinted on his soul. Were they simply coincidences, a cruel joke of genetics? Or were they, as the report suggested, an inextricable part of him? His heart ached, a dull, throbbing pain that resonated with the deep-seated loneliness that had haunted him since childhood. The loneliness that he'd meticulously buried beneath layers of success, wealth, and carefully constructed emotional detachment. Now, that carefully constructed wall was crumbling, and with it, the foundation of his life. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Arthur stared at the report, the stark black lettering swimming before his eyes. He felt the tremor in his hands, the cold sweat clinging to his skin. The opulent study, usually a sanctuary of calm, felt claustrophobic. He needed escape, but the thought of facing Eleanor, of explaining this impossible truth, paralyzed him. He rose, the plush carpet yielding softly beneath his feet. The French doors, usually a gateway to serenity, now seemed to mock his turmoil. He stepped onto the balcony, the cool night air a stark contrast to the fiery chaos within. The city lights twinkled distantly, a million pinpricks of light against the inky canvas of the sky. But the beauty held no solace. A sob escaped, ragged and raw, a sound he hadn't uttered in years. He clutched the railing, the cold metal a painful comfort against his shaking hands. The weight of his secret pressed down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs. He wasn't just a successful CEO. He was a father he never knew he had. His phone vibrated, the insistent buzzing a jarring intrusion on his grief. He saw Eleanor's name on the screen, a silent accusation. He ignored it, the silence a refuge from the storm raging inside him. The image of Liam, his own eyes staring back from a younger face, burned behind his eyelids. The thought of 3 children, his children living in poverty, while he basked in luxury. The injustice was a physical blow. He closed his eyes, the darkness offering a momentary reprieve from the truth. The scent of roses from his garden, usually a source of quiet pleasure, now felt suffocating. He needed to breathe, to think, to find a way to navigate this treacherous new terrain. But the path forward remained shrouded in a darkness as vast and terrifying as the revelation itself. His carefully constructed world had crumbled, revealing the fragile foundation beneath. And in its place, a terrifying, yet strangely compelling, new reality was dawning. The DNA results felt like a physical blow. Arthur reread the report, the stark clinical language a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside him. The opulent study, usually a haven of calm, was now a suffocating cage. He felt the cold marble of the fireplace against his cheek as he sank to the floor, the plush rug offering little comfort. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars, usually comforting, now felt cloying, suffocating him. He pictured Liam's face, the same stubborn set to his jaw, the same haunted glint in his eyes. Maya's bright smile, so like Eleanor's, but tinged with a sadness that mirrored his own. Chloe's quiet strength, her gaze holding a wisdom beyond her years, a reflection of his own buried resilience. 3 children, his children, living in the shadow of his gilded cage. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He clutched at his stomach, the opulent Persian rug doing little to soften the harshness of the marble floor. He thought of Eleanor, her unwavering grace, her effortless elegance. How could he shatter her world, this meticulously constructed life they had built together. The thought was a physical wound. His phone buzzed again, Eleanor's name flashing on the screen. He ignored it, the silence preferable to the storm brewing within him. The city lights outside, usually a symbol of his success, mocked him now, a million glittering reminders of the chasm between his life and his children's. He needed air. He stumbled to the balcony, the cool night air a balm against the burning shame. Below, the city pulsed with life, oblivious to his shattering truth. He looked up at the stars, their vastness a small comfort in this overwhelming grief. He felt utterly alone, yet strangely connected to these three children he never knew. A connection forged in the shared blood that ran through their veins. The impossible truth was settling. It was a heavy burden, but it was also a lifeline. He had to tell Eleanor, to face this, to find a path through the wreckage of his carefully constructed life. He knew with a terrifying certainty that this was only the beginning. The weight of his secret, once a crushing burden, now felt like a call to action. A daunting, terrifying, yet strangely compelling call. The weight of the news pressed down on Arthur like a physical force. He stared at the DNA report, the clinical language blurring through his tears. The opulent study, usually his sanctuary, felt like a tomb. He sank into a plush armchair, the silk cool against his burning skin. He felt the tremor in his hands as he reached for a crystal decanter, the clinking of ice against glass a jarring counterpoint to the silence in his soul. He swallowed the whiskey in one gulp, the fiery liquid doing little to soothe the burning shame that gnawed at him. He closed his eyes, picturing Liam's stubborn chin, Maya's radiant smile, Chloe's quiet strength. Their faces, so achingly familiar, haunted him. Three children, his children, living lives a world away from his. A lifetime of carefully constructed walls crumbled around him. The phone buzzed again, Eleanor. He couldn't. Not yet. The silence felt less suffocating than the storm raging within. He needed air, needed to escape the gilded cage of his own making. He stumbled onto the balcony, the city lights a dizzying spectacle of glittering indifference. Below, the city throbbed with life, oblivious to his shattering truth. The night air, sharp and cool, offered a momentary respite. The stars, a billion pinpricks of light in the vast darkness, seemed to mock his insignificance, yet also offered a strange sense of connection. He wasn't alone. He was bound to these three children by an invisible thread, a shared bloodline that transcended distance and circumstance. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, leaving a cold trail in its wake. He swirled the remaining whiskey in his glass, the amber liquid reflecting the chaos in his soul. This wasn't just a revelation. It was a reckoning, a shattering of his carefully constructed world, but also, perhaps, the beginning of something else. A path forward, however terrifying, towards a responsibility he could no longer ignore. He had to tell Eleanor. He had to face this. He had to build bridges across the chasm that separated him from his children. The impossible truth had arrived, and with it, a burden, a responsibility, a daunting, terrible, and yet strangely beautiful new beginning. The days bled into each other, a blur of restless nights and haunted days. Arthur found himself drawn to the balcony, the city's nocturnal hum a low thrum against the silence within his opulent home. He'd stare at the distant, glittering lights, each a tiny spark of a life lived outside the confines of his own shattering truth. The weight of his secret pressed down, a physical burden, each breath a struggle. He tried to work, but the spreadsheet swam before his eyes, the numbers meaningless. His usually sharp mind felt dull, blunted by the enormity of it all. Eleanor, sensing his distance, tried to reach him. Her gentle touch met with a flinch, a stiffening of his shoulders that spoke volumes. He saw the hurt in her eyes, and it added another layer to the crushing guilt. One evening, he found himself unconsciously sketching in his notebook, not diagrams, not plans, but the faces of Liam, Maya, and Chloe. Their eyes, so strikingly familiar, haunted him from the page. He caught himself tracing the line of Liam's stubborn jaw, the delicate curve of Maya's smile, Chloe's quiet strength reflected in the set of her chin. A single tear fell, smudging the graphite. He wiped it away roughly, a frustrated sigh escaping his lips. He felt the stirrings of something new within him, a nascent, terrifying affection that warred with his ingrained self-preservation. He thought of their lives, of their poverty, their resilience, their innocence. The contrast with his own privileged life felt like an unbearable injustice. He saw the echoes of his own neglected childhood in their bright, hopeful eyes, a painful recognition that cut him to the core. The guilt was a living thing, twisting within him, demanding action. He needed to see them again, but the fear of shattering the carefully constructed illusion of his own life held him back. He was a man paralyzed by his own creation, a gilded cage of his own design. The phone rang, startling him. He didn't answer. The silence was preferable to the conversation he knew he needed to have. He had to tell Eleanor, but the words wouldn't form. The truth hung heavy between them, a vast unspoken chasm threatening to swallow them both. The following week blurred into a haze of avoidance. Arthur found himself pacing the length of his study, the polished mahogany floor cool beneath his bare feet. The city lights, once a symbol of his success, now felt like mocking reminders of the life he'd built on a lie. He could smell the faint scent of Eleanor's lavender perfume lingering in the air, a ghost of their intimacy, now tainted with the bitter knowledge of his secret. He picked up a framed photograph of Eleanor, her smile radiant, her eyes full of a love he felt increasingly undeserving of. His fingers traced the outline of her face, a pang of guilt sharp enough to make him gasp. He finally dialed the orphanage, his voice trembling slightly. Sister Agnes, her voice warm and patient, answered. "Mr. Blackwood? It's so good to hear from you. The children were asking about you." The words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his chest. I'd like to visit them," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. "Of course, dear. Anytime. They'll be so happy." The gentle understanding in her voice offered a small solace, a tiny crack in the wall of his self-imposed isolation. He arrived at St. Jude's an hour later, the familiar scent of disinfectant and old wood filling his nostrils. Liam, Maya, and Chloe were playing in the courtyard, their laughter ringing out, pure and bright. The sight of them, their unburdened joy, struck him with a wave of something akin to longing. He watched them for a long moment, his heart constricting in his chest. The resemblance was undeniable, a stark mirror reflecting a truth he could no longer ignore. He approached cautiously, his steps hesitant, unsure how they would react. Liam, ever the bold one, spotted him first. "Mr. Blackwood," he shouted, a wide grin splitting his face. Maya and Chloe followed his gaze, their expressions a mixture of surprise and hesitant joy. He knelt, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it, the first tentative step towards a future he could barely comprehend. The children swarmed him, their small hands grasping his, their eyes shining with an unexpected warmth. He felt a lump forming in his throat, and the tears he'd been fighting back finally spilled over, blurring his vision. In that moment, the weight of his secret felt lighter, replaced by the tentative blossom of something new, a love he had long denied himself, and a responsibility he could no longer evade. The orphanage's worn wooden swing set creaked a mournful tune in the crisp autumn air. Liam, Maya, and Chloe, usually a whirlwind of energy, sat unusually subdued, their small hands clasped tightly. Arthur, watching from a shadowed bench, felt a pang of guilt sharper than any boardroom confrontation. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the air, mirroring the decay he felt inside himself. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the quiet. It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" The words felt clumsy, inadequate. Liam, the eldest, looked up, his eyes mirroring the same hesitant uncertainty. "It is," he whispered, his gaze dropping to his scuffed shoes. Maya, usually the most talkative, simply nodded, her fingers tracing a pattern on her worn sweater. Chloe, the youngest, remained silent, her gaze fixed on a flitting butterfly. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat tightening. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, worn leather pouch he'd found among his father's belongings. The same pouch Chloe had been carrying. He opened it, revealing 3 identical, smooth, gray stones, each bearing a tiny, almost invisible inscription. I found this," he stammered, offering the pouch. I think it might belong to you." A flicker of recognition sparked in Liam's eyes. He reached out, his small fingers hesitant as they brushed Arthur's. Maya and Chloe leaned closer, their faces illuminated by a mixture of curiosity and hope. The simple act of sharing the stones felt like a bridge being built across a chasm of years and silence. For the first time, Arthur felt a connection, a fragile link to these children who were undeniably a part of him. The weight of his denial was beginning to lift, replaced by a tentative, terrifying hope. The autumn sun, casting long shadows across the courtyard, seemed to warm him from the inside. The sterile white walls of the doctor's office seemed to amplify the silence, a stark contrast to the chaotic storm raging inside Arthur. The DNA results sat on the desk, a crisp white envelope mocking his inability to open it. The scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a bitter perfume to the nausea churning in his stomach. He felt trapped, a prisoner of his own carefully constructed life, a life now teetering on the precipice of utter collapse. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture more frantic than usual. The cool leather of his briefcase felt strangely comforting against his clammy palm. He could hear the faint hum of the city outside, a muted symphony of distant sirens and car horns. Yet, inside the small, hushed room, only the relentless beat of his own heart filled the void. He pictured the children's faces, Liam's earnest eyes, Maya's quick smile, Chloe's quiet contemplation. The resemblance, once a fleeting thought, now screamed at him from every corner of his memory. He finally picked up the envelope, his fingers trembling. The crisp paper felt strangely cold against his skin. He tore it open, his breath catching in his throat as he scanned the stark, clinical language. The words blurred, swimming before his eyes. He read them again, each syllable a hammer blow against the fragile scaffolding of his carefully constructed reality. The confirmation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Paternity confirmed. 3 times over. He sank into the chair, the cold leather a stark contrast to the sudden, searing heat that flooded his veins. The perfect life, the meticulously crafted image, all shattered like fragile glass. Panic clawed at his throat, a suffocating wave threatening to pull him under. He felt a strange mix of terror and a nascent, unsettling sense of responsibility, a responsibility he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. The weight of it pressed down on him, crushing him under its immense burden. His carefully constructed world had crumbled, revealing a raw, vulnerable core he'd buried deep within himself for decades. The silence in the room felt deafening, filled only by the frantic rhythm of his own breath. He closed his eyes, the image of the 3 children's faces burned into his mind, a haunting reminder of the life he had unknowingly created, a life he was now forced to confront. The weight of his denial was crushing, but beneath it, a seed of something else began to take root. A terrifying, uncertain, yet strangely compelling hope. The orphanage smelled of antiseptic and old wood, a faint sweetness clinging to the air from the overripe apples someone had left on a windowsill. Arthur hesitated at the doorway, the polished leather of his shoes seeming out of place on the worn linoleum. Liam, the eldest, was building a precarious tower of blocks, his brow furrowed in concentration. Maya, a whirlwind of energy, chased a butterfly painted on a peeling wall, her laughter echoing softly. Chloe sat quietly, sketching in a worn notebook, her gaze distant. He watched them, unseen, a silent observer in a world so different from his own. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle and unfamiliar. Liam looked up, his eyes, those startlingly familiar eyes, widening slightly. "Mr. Blackwood?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Arthur swallowed, the words catching in his throat. "Yes, Liam," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. He moved closer, the rough texture of the wooden floor a stark contrast to the plush carpets of his penthouse. He knelt, the movement awkward and hesitant, feeling the weight of his own history press down on him. How is the tower coming along?" he managed, the question sounding clumsy and inadequate even to his own ears. Liam's expression softened. "It's almost finished," he said, his gaze returning to his creation. A fragile smile touched his lips. The resemblance to Arthur was uncanny, not just in features, but in the subtle twitch of a muscle around his mouth, a shared family trait Arthur had never known he possessed. Maya, her butterfly chase abandoned, wandered over, her small hand reaching out to touch Arthur's sleeve. The touch, light as a feather, sent a shockwave through him, a jolt of unexpected emotion. It was a moment of raw vulnerability, a crack in his carefully constructed armor. He felt a lump form in his throat, the silent acknowledgement of a bond he had vehemently denied. He gently touched her hand, a tentative, halting gesture that surprised them both. In that shared touch, in the silent exchange of hesitant understanding, a new chapter began, however uncertain its path might be. The scent of apples, antiseptic and old wood, became the subtle perfume of a burgeoning connection, a tentative step towards a future that now seemed both frightening and exhilarating. The sterile white of the laboratory felt like a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of the orphanage. Arthur sat rigidly, the crisp cotton of his shirt a discomfort against his skin. The air hung heavy with anticipation, a silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock, each second a hammer blow against his carefully constructed composure. He'd chosen this anonymous lab, a sterile environment mirroring the emotional distance he'd built around himself for decades. The doctor entered, a woman with kind eyes that belied the gravity of the news she carried. She placed a file on the table, the paper crisp and unforgiving. "Mr. Blackwood?" she began, her voice soft yet firm. "The results are conclusive." He stared at the file, his heart a trapped bird beating against his ribs. He knew somehow even before she spoke the words. "The DNA confirms paternity," she said simply. The words hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Arthur felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying sensation that threatened to pull him under. 3 children, his children, the carefully curated life he'd built, the image of success and control, crumbled around him like dry leaves in a fierce wind. He left the lab in a daze, the city's vibrant energy a blur. The taxi ride felt like an eternity, the hum of the engine a relentless drone in his ears. He reached his penthouse, the opulent space now a hollow shell, devoid of comfort. He sank onto a plush sofa, the soft leather offering no solace. The news hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air, struggling to process the sheer impossibility of it all. Eleanor, his wife, how could he tell her? The thought was a cold dread, a crushing weight on his chest. He looked at his reflection in the polished glass of a skyscraper, a stranger staring back. This man, this successful CEO, was a fraud, a man who had built his life on a foundation of lies and omissions. The silence of the penthouse pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of guilt and fear. The only sound was the frantic pounding of his own heart, a relentless reminder of the seismic shift that had just occurred in his life. He needed time, he thought, desperately needing to gather himself, to formulate a plan, to somehow navigate this uncharted territory of his own making. But even time, he knew, wouldn't erase the stark reality of the truth that now stared him in the face. Days bled into weeks. The sterile white of the lab report, a persistent image burned into Arthur's mind. He avoided the penthouse, finding refuge in the anonymity of a small, rented apartment overlooking a bustling city square. The constant hum of traffic was a dull roar, a comforting counterpoint to the storm raging within. He'd barely slept, the children's faces, Liam's mischievous grin, Maya's thoughtful eyes, Chloe's quiet strength, haunting his dreams. He found himself drawn to St. Jude's, watching from afar. He saw Liam kicking a worn soccer ball, its faded colors mirroring the tattered state of his own carefully constructed world. He saw Maya helping a younger child with her homework, her small hands patient and kind. Chloe sat alone, sketching in a worn notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. The sight of them, their resilience in the face of hardship, stirred something deep within him, a painful, unfamiliar tenderness. One afternoon, he found himself approaching the orphanage gates. He hesitated, the worn wood cold beneath his touch. He took a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke filling his lungs, a stark contrast to the sterile perfumes of his usual life. Sister Agnes, her face etched with years of caring for others, greeted him with a surprised but welcoming smile. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice gentle, "what brings you back?" He mumbled something about needing to talk. He felt ridiculous, a powerful CEO reduced to stammering before a nun. He cleared his throat. I wanted to see the children," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sister Agnes led him to the playroom. The children were instantly captivated by this imposing man who seemed to have emerged from another world. Liam, ever bold, asked, "Are you here to adopt us, mister?" Arthur choked. He looked at their expectant faces, a mixture of hope and apprehension in their bright eyes. He could only manage a shaky nod. I want to get to know you," he stammered, feeling the first fragile tendrils of paternal love unfurl within his hardened heart. The weight of his deception pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. But in that moment, surrounded by the innocence of these children, he knew he couldn't run away any longer. The journey ahead would be difficult, a path paved with both immense joy and undeniable sorrow, but he was finally, tentatively, ready to begin. The playroom buzzed with the chaotic energy of children at play. Liam, a whirlwind of freckled limbs, chased Maya, her laughter a bright, tinkling sound that cut through the air thick with the scent of paint and sawdust. Chloe, perched quietly in a corner, sketched furiously in her worn notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. The sounds were a jarring contrast to the sterile silence of Arthur's penthouse. He watched them, a stranger in a strange land, his tailored suit feeling utterly out of place amidst the worn toys and mismatched furniture. The air hung heavy with the unspoken, a tension only he seemed to feel. He approached hesitantly, his polished shoes crunching on stray bits of crayon. Liam, ever bold, stopped his game to stare. "You're back," he stated, his eyes shrewd for a child of 8. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound strangely loud in the quiet room. "Yes," he managed, his voice raspy from disuse. I wanted to see how you were all doing." The words felt clumsy, inadequate. Maya, her eyes still bright with laughter, approached cautiously. "Are you going to adopt us now?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. The question hit him like a physical blow. The weight of his carefully constructed life, his marriage to Eleanor, the potential fallout of this revelation. It all threatened to suffocate him. He looked at their expectant faces, a mixture of hope and trepidation mirrored in their bright, questioning eyes. He hadn't anticipated this. He'd expected denial, avoidance, anything but this raw, unfiltered hope. He knelt, the rough floorboards digging into his expensive trousers. He forced a smile, a hesitant, unfamiliar expression that felt foreign on his face. I don't know yet," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. "But I want to get to know you all better." The admission felt monumental, a crack in the icy wall he'd built around his heart. He saw a flicker of understanding in Maya's eyes, a tentative acceptance. Liam, however, remained skeptical, his gaze unwavering. Chloe, still sketching, didn't look up. He spent the afternoon observing them, watching their interactions, their resilience, their shared laughter. He saw the subtle ways they cared for each other, the unspoken bonds that connected them. It was a glimpse into a life he'd never known, a life that was both strangely familiar and utterly foreign. As he left, the setting sun casting long shadows across the orphanage grounds, he felt a faint stirring of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. But it was laced with a profound, almost crippling fear of the future, of the life that awaited him and these 3 children he'd just begun to know. The weight of his secret remained, a heavy burden he carried alone, for now. The mahogany door to the Blackwood mansion slammed shut, the sound echoing the fury churning inside Eleanor. The scent of lilies, usually comforting, now felt suffocating, a cruel reminder of the opulent cage she'd inhabited. She paced the vast, silent living room, the polished floors reflecting the storm in her eyes. Arthur's confession, delivered with a tremor in his voice, hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the scent of old money. 3 children, an orphanage, DNA. The words replayed like a broken record, each repetition sharpening the blade of betrayal. The meticulously arranged furniture seemed to mock her, symbols of a life built on lies. She touched the cool, smooth surface of a crystal vase, its delicate fragility a stark contrast to the shattering of her world. The weight of her carefully constructed life, the charity galas, the social events, the carefully cultivated image of the perfect wife of a powerful man, crumbled under the weight of Arthur's shocking secret. Tears, hot and stinging, finally broke the dam. She sank onto a plush velvet chaise lounge, the softness offering little comfort. Grief warred with rage, a volatile cocktail of emotions that left her breathless. Betrayal wasn't just the infidelity. It was the deception, the years of lies woven into the very fabric of their existence. Had she known nothing? Had she been so blinded by privilege and position that she missed the signs? The sharp ring of the telephone cut through her despair. She snatched it up, her voice tight with unshed tears. It was her lawyer, his voice measured, professional, yet hinting at the impending storm. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, his words precise and chilling. "The implications of this revelation are significant. We need to discuss the legal and financial ramifications immediately." The calm, clinical tone only amplified the chaos inside her. Eleanor's carefully constructed world was unraveling, thread by thread, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in the cold light of reality. The fight for her life, and perhaps for her sanity, had begun. The lawyer's words hung in the air, a death knell to Eleanor's carefully curated life. The scent of lilies, sharp and cloying, now felt like a suffocating shroud. She stared at the polished mahogany of her desk, its flawless surface a cruel mirror to the shattering of her reality. "Significant ramifications," he'd said. The understatement was a blow in itself. "Arthur?" she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. She'd loved him, or so she thought. Had she been blind, a fool, so consumed by the gilded cage of their life that she hadn't seen the cracks? The next few days were a blur of hushed phone calls, legal documents, and strained silences. The mansion, once a symbol of security, now felt like a prison. She avoided the staff, their curious glances burning like accusations. Sleep offered no respite, her dreams a chaotic jumble of Arthur's face, the children's wide, innocent eyes, and the lawyer's cold, precise words. One afternoon, she found herself wandering through the manicured gardens, the vibrant blooms offering no comfort. The clipped hedges, so perfectly formed, mirrored the rigid control she'd maintained over her life, a control now irrevocably shattered. She sank onto a stone bench, the cool stone a jarring contrast to the heat of her tears. A sob escaped her lips, raw and unfiltered. She'd built her life around Arthur, her identity entwined with his success, his image. Now that identity lay in ruins. She thought of the charity galas, the smiles, the effortless grace. It had all been a performance, a carefully constructed facade. A rustle in the bushes startled her. She wiped her eyes, composing herself. It was Liam, the eldest of Arthur's children. He stood hesitantly at the edge of the path, his eyes mirroring the same vulnerability she felt. "Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor swallowed, the lump in her throat making it hard to speak. "Liam," she managed, her voice trembling. He took a tentative step closer, his gaze fixed on hers. I heard about everything," he said, his words laced with a quiet sadness that mirrored her own. "I'm sorry." The unexpected apology, the simple act of him coming to her, broke through the wall of her despair. Tears welled up again, but this time, they weren't just tears of grief and anger. There was a glimmer of something else. Understanding, perhaps, or the faintest possibility of a connection. "It's all right, Liam," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out, her hand hovering over his. He didn't flinch. Instead, he gently took her hand in his. The simple touch, small and fragile, was a lifeline in the storm. The fight wasn't over, but in that moment, amidst the wreckage of her carefully constructed world, Eleanor felt a fragile seed of hope begin to take root. The confrontation wasn't a screaming match, but a slow, agonizing unraveling. Eleanor, perched on the edge of their king-sized bed, the crisp linen cool against her skin, stared at Arthur. The expensive silk pajamas he wore, usually a symbol of their effortless luxury, now seemed ludicrously out of place. The morning light, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, cast long shadows across the room, emphasizing the chasm between them. The air hung heavy with unspoken accusations. The scent of his cologne, usually comforting, now felt suffocating, a reminder of the carefully crafted illusion. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the quiet hum of the central heating. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Arthur, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, avoided her gaze. He ran a hand through his usually impeccably styled hair, disheveling it in a gesture of self-destruction. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked down at his hands, his knuckles white as he clenched them into fists. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, filled only with the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. The rhythmic tick-tock seemed to mock the stillness of their grief. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. I didn't know," he stammered, the words barely audible. His voice cracked, betraying the carefully constructed composure he'd maintained for so long. I never meant to hurt you." Eleanor's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Hurt me?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "You've shattered everything we built, on a lie." She rose abruptly, the movement jarring in the stillness of the room. She paced, her steps echoing in the vast space, the rhythmic sound a stark counterpoint to the turmoil within her. The crystal decanter on the dresser, a gift from his father, seemed to shimmer with a cruel irony. "It wasn't a lie," Arthur said, his voice stronger now, imbued with a desperate plea. I was lost. I didn't know they existed." He paused, searching for the right words, the right way to express the profound turmoil within him. Finding them, it was like finding a missing piece of myself. He looked at her, pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. The words felt inadequate, pathetic even, in the face of her pain. The ornate gilded frame of a landscape painting on the wall seemed to mock the crumbling reality of their world. Eleanor's silence was a weapon, sharper than any scream. The opulent bedroom, usually a sanctuary of comfort, felt like a mausoleum. Sunlight, usually a symbol of hope, now cast harsh angles, highlighting the lines of worry etched around her eyes. The faint scent of lilies from the vase on the dresser, usually a subtle, pleasant aroma, now felt cloying, heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations. Arthur watched her pace. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her heels against the polished wood floor a relentless counterpoint to the turmoil in his own heart. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to somehow bridge the chasm that had opened between them, but he was paralyzed by fear. His carefully constructed world, the one built on ambition and control, was crumbling around him. The weight of his secret, the magnitude of his deception, pressed down on him like a physical burden. I didn't know," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He wanted to explain, to make her understand the overwhelming sense of responsibility that had consumed him upon learning the truth. the powerful pull towards the 3 children who bore his face. But the words seemed inadequate, pale and lifeless against the storm raging within her. Eleanor stopped pacing, her back to him. The delicate silk of her robe whispered against the fabric of the chair as she sank into it, the movement slow and deliberate, laden with a profound weariness. Her shoulders slumped, the elegant posture that was her hallmark collapsing under the weight of her emotions. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to hammer the passing of time, each tick a stark reminder of the irretrievable damage done. Finally, she turned, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her gaze piercing. 3 children, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. 3 children you kept hidden from me, from us, for years. Her voice cracked, betraying the carefully maintained composure she'd worked so hard to maintain. Arthur winced. He knew the pain he'd inflicted, the profound betrayal that lay between them. The children weren't just a secret. They were a shattering revelation of a past he'd desperately tried to bury. They needed me, he stammered, the words a feeble attempt at justification. He looked at his hands again, wishing they could somehow erase the truth. Needed you? Eleanor echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Needed you and you hid them? You chose your ambition, your empire, over your own flesh and blood. She looked away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The luxurious surroundings mocked the fragility of their marriage, the opulence setting a stark contrast to the raw emotion filling the room. The chasm between them felt vast and unbridgeable, the silence a testament to the broken trust that lay at its heart. The future, once so certain, now seemed uncertain, frighteningly so. The legal papers lay scattered across Arthur's mahogany desk, a stark contrast to the plush leather chair he occupied. Each document felt like a weight, a confirmation of the storm brewing outside the confines of his opulent office. The city, usually a vibrant tapestry of lights and sounds, felt muted, distant. His world, once sharply defined by lines of power and control, now blurred into an unsettling haze. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. His phone vibrated, the insistent buzz jarring in the sudden silence. He hesitated, then answered. Eleanor's voice, clipped and controlled, sent a shiver down his spine. "The lawyers are here," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. "They want to discuss the situation." The meeting was a blur of legal jargon and strained silences. Arthur felt the cold gaze of the lawyers, their detached professionalism a stark contrast to the tempest raging within him. He watched Eleanor, her face a mask of controlled fury, her hand gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a mocking reminder of time relentlessly marching on. Later, alone in his study, the weight of it all crashed down. He picked up a framed photo of Liam, Maya, and Chloe, their faces beaming with an innocent joy that cut him to the core. He saw his own reflection in their eyes, a reflection of his own lost childhood, his own deep-seated yearning for connection. The guilt was a physical presence, a heavy cloak smothering him. He built an empire, but at what cost? The cost of a relationship with his own children, the cost of his marriage. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in the glass like a miniature vortex of his own conflicted emotions. The burn of the alcohol offered a momentary solace, a fleeting distraction from the crushing weight of reality. The path ahead was uncertain, treacherous. But for the first time, Arthur Blackwood felt a flicker of something beyond ambition and control. A glimmer of hope, fragile but persistent, fueled by a father's love. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of the lawyer's office, a stark contrast to the opulent aroma of Arthur's study. Eleanor sat rigid, her silence a formidable wall. The lawyer, a smooth-talking man with a practiced smile, outlined the potential legal battles, custody disputes, inheritance challenges, public scrutiny. Each word was a blow, each sentence chipping away at the carefully constructed facade of Arthur's life. He felt Eleanor's gaze, sharp and unforgiving. This changes everything," Eleanor finally said, her voice tight with unshed tears. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. Arthur wanted to reach for her, to offer solace, but fear held him back. The chasm between them felt vast, unbridgeable. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, a reflection of his own inner turmoil. The years of carefully built walls, the emotional detachment he'd cultivated as a shield, crumbled under the weight of this devastating truth. He traded his children for success, and now the cost was far greater than he'd ever imagined. Later, alone in the harsh glare of a hotel room, the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window. The city that once represented his power now felt alien, cold. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the burning heat of his shame. He dialed a number, the familiar ringtone a strange comfort. "Liam?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper. He heard a hesitant hello, a small, cautious sound that mirrored the trepidation in his own heart. The conversation was stilted, awkward, but beneath the surface, Arthur sensed a tentative connection, a fragile hope. He heard Liam's voice again, a hesitant question. Are you coming to visit?" The simple question hung in the air, a lifeline in the storm. The words were a raw, honest plea, a silent acknowledgement of the deep longing in both their hearts. Arthur felt a tear roll down his cheek, a release of years of pent-up emotion, a silent admission of his failures and his desperate yearning for redemption. The path ahead was treacherous, strewn with obstacles and uncertainty. Yet for the first time, a fragile seed of hope began to take root in the barren landscape of his soul. He would fight for his children, for his family, for a future he hadn't dared to dream possible. He would rebuild not just his empire, but himself. The lawyer's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the humidity clinging to the city. Eleanor's silence was a physical presence, a wall of icy disapproval. Arthur felt the weight of it, a crushing burden added to the already immense pressure of his revelation. He watched her, her usually vibrant eyes dulled with a hurt that mirrored his own. The opulence of his life, once a source of pride, felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in a web of his own making. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, tentative. She didn't pull away, but neither did she return the gesture. The silence stretched, taut and fragile, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the lawyer's expensive clock. "Eleanor," he began, his voice a low rumble. I didn't know." Her gaze remained fixed on him, searching, accusatory. "Didn't know? Arthur, you've built this life on lies." The words were sharp, precise, each syllable a tiny dagger. He flinched under her scrutiny, the years of emotional armor crumbling. "It wasn't intentional," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I was lost." He wanted to explain his childhood, the abandonment, the desperate need to build a life free from the pain of his past. But the words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his guilt. He saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a glimmer of the woman he loved, lost in the storm of their present reality. A woman capable of compassion, of understanding. A flicker of hope, fragile but tenacious. Leaving the lawyer's office felt like stepping out of a suffocating tomb into a humid, unforgiving city. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window of his chauffeured car, an alien landscape now, devoid of its usual allure. He felt the heavy silence between them, a chasm mirroring the one growing between him and his children's mother. The phone call to Liam was tentative, hesitant. He'd chosen a life devoid of genuine connection. Now he had to rebuild that life, one precarious conversation at a time. The question, Are you coming to visit?" hung heavy with a child's longing and a father's regret. The simple plea became a turning point, a fragile seed of hope piercing through the hardened ground of his shame. The lawyer's office, a sterile space of polished wood and muted tones, felt miles away. The city's humid breath clung to Arthur as he walked, the rain a slick mirror reflecting the city lights in fractured bursts. He felt exposed, raw, the carefully constructed facade of his life crumbling. The weight of Eleanor's words, "You've built this life on lies," echoed in the empty spaces between the city's sounds. Each drop of rain felt like a tiny accusation. His chauffeured car, usually a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage. He sank into the leather, the cool, smooth surface offering little comfort. The phone pressed to his ear, Liam's hesitant voice a fragile thread in the vast silence. Are you coming to visit?" The child's question, simple yet profound, sliced through his carefully built defenses. Arthur's throat tightened. He could almost feel the boy's longing, a desperate need for connection that mirrored his own desperate need for redemption. He cleared his throat, the sound strained, unfamiliar. "Yes, Liam. I'm coming to see you." The words felt strange, foreign on his tongue, yet they carried a weight of promise. A promise he desperately hoped to keep. The news spread like wildfire, whispers in boardrooms, hushed tones in social circles. The legal team mobilized, a flurry of activity designed to mitigate the damage, to protect his empire. But Arthur felt strangely detached. The loss of his carefully curated image, the potential financial ruin, all seemed insignificant compared to the weight of his newfound responsibility. His world, once defined by deals and acquisitions, now revolved around the uncertain future of 3 children he'd never known. The legal battles looming, the social fallout, were all secondary to the gaping hole in his heart, a space yearning to be filled with a love he'd denied himself for so long. The rain continued, mirroring the storm brewing within him, a cleansing deluge that promised, perhaps, a rebirth. The peeling paint of his childhood home clawed at Arthur's memory, a stark contrast to the polished marble of his current life. He stood before it, a dilapidated structure swallowed by overgrown weeds, the scent of damp earth and decay heavy in the air. This was where his own abandonment had taken root, a silent, festering wound he'd meticulously ignored. His knuckles, usually so steady, were white as he knocked on the warped wood, a hesitant shuffling from within. The door creaked open, revealing a woman whose face was etched with a lifetime of hardship. Her eyes, the same shade of gray as his own, filled with a guarded weariness. This was Margaret, his mother, a ghost from a past he desperately tried to bury. "Arthur." Her voice was thin, raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Yes, Mother." The word felt foreign, unfamiliar on his tongue. He hadn't called her that in decades. She stepped aside, revealing a dimly lit interior, the air thick with the smell of dust and stale cigarettes. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Photos, faded and cracked, lined a mantelpiece, a young Arthur, a fleeting glimpse of a happiness he barely remembered. I needed to understand," Arthur began, his voice thick with unshed tears. Why did you leave me?" Margaret's gaze drifted to the photos, her shoulders slumping. "I wasn't strong enough, Arthur. Not strong enough to raise you, not strong enough to fight for you." Her voice cracked, the words spilling out like a dam had broken. "It was the only choice I thought I had." Silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner, each second a hammer blow to Arthur's already shattered composure. He saw then, not the woman who had abandoned him, but a desperate young mother overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. A wave of empathy washed over him, a profound understanding that transcended resentment. He began, searching for the words that could bridge the chasm of years and pain. "I forgive you, Mother." The words were whispered, a fragile bridge built over years of bitterness and neglect. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he took hers, her skin paper-thin and frail under his touch. He saw, reflected in her watery eyes, a flicker of the mother he'd never known, and a glimmer of the forgiveness he'd long sought. The weight of his past, for a moment, felt a little lighter, the path ahead, slightly clearer. The chipped mug warmed Arthur's hands, the lukewarm tea doing little to soothe the turmoil within. Margaret's confession had cracked open a dam of buried emotions, leaving him raw and exposed. He stared out the grimy window, the relentless rain mirroring the storm raging inside him. The dilapidated house, a testament to years of neglect, felt strangely comforting, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of his own life. He'd expected anger, resentment, a need for retribution. Instead, a weary empathy had settled over him, a heavy cloak of understanding. He returned to the worn armchair, the springs groaning a mournful song. Margaret sat opposite, her gaze fixed on the flickering gas fire, the shadows dancing on her lined face. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window panes. Finally, Arthur spoke, his voice a low rumble. I never knew." Margaret nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles etched around her eyes. "Your father, he was a good man, Arthur. But he wasn't ready for a child. I wasn't either." She paused, her breath hitching in her chest. It was a different time. Options were limited. He understood. He understood the desperation, the crushing weight of circumstance that had driven her to make the choices she did. He saw her not as a villain but as a woman broken by a life of hardship. "And me?" he whispered, the question hanging in the air. "You left me. Why?" Margaret looked at him then, her eyes holding a lifetime of regret. "I loved you, Arthur, more than anything, but I believed I was protecting you." The shattering impact of his revelation. "It wasn't a conscious choice," he began again, his voice softer this time, devoid of the self-justification that had tainted his previous attempts. "It was fear, a lifetime of it." He gestured to the orchids, their delicate petals a fragile echo of their relationship. "I built this life, this perfection, to shield myself from the pain of my own past. And when the truth emerged, I panicked. I saw it as a threat to everything." Eleanor finally turned. Her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence and warmth, were clouded with a pain that mirrored his own. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, until she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "And what about my pain? My life, built on the same foundation of trust you so carelessly shattered?" He reached out again, his touch hesitant, yet filled with the yearning for connection. "I know, and I'm so sorry. More than you'll ever know." He saw a flicker of something, not forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in the icy wall she'd erected around her heart. A tear traced a path down her cheek, catching the light like a fleeting diamond. "They need a father," he added softly, his voice catching. "And I need them." He spoke not of obligation, but of a profound and growing love that was beginning to redefine him. His confession, stripped bare of self-preservation, seemed to resonate in the quiet space. The weight of his past mistakes hung heavy, but a fragile hope, as delicate as an orchid's bloom, began to blossom in the aftermath of the storm. The question of reconciliation hung in the air, unanswered, yet charged with the potential for a new beginning. The following weeks were a blur of quiet adjustments. Arthur, surprisingly, thrived in the unfamiliar role of father. The sterile order of his penthouse was disrupted by the joyous chaos of 3 children. Liam's infectious laughter echoed through the once silent halls. Maya's vibrant artwork adorned the walls, and Chloe's quiet observations offered a poignant counterpoint to their boisterous energy. He found himself captivated by their resilience, their inherent goodness untarnished by their harsh beginnings. The scent of freshly baked cookies, a stark contrast to his usual gourmet meals, filled the air, a sweet testament to his evolving life. One evening, finding himself alone with Maya, he watched as she meticulously arranged wildflowers she'd picked in the sprawling gardens. Her small hands, stained with earth, moved with a delicate precision that mirrored the intricate detail in her paintings. "There for you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He knelt beside her, the cool marble floor a surprising contrast to the warmth blooming in his chest. He carefully took the bouquet, the fragrant blossoms a tangible symbol of his blossoming paternal love. "Thank you, Maya," he said, his voice thick with emotion, a stark departure from his usual controlled tones. They're beautiful. The unspoken understanding between them was a silent promise, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their shared past. He saw not just a reflection of himself in her eyes, but a future he'd never dared to imagine. A future filled with the messy, chaotic, and ultimately beautiful reality of family. He felt a pang of guilt, a sharp reminder of Eleanor's absence, her quiet suffering a constant undercurrent in their newfound happiness. He knew reconciliation wouldn't be easy, but the unwavering love for his children gave him the strength to continue, to navigate the complexities of his changed life. One small step at a time, one fragile flower at a time. The weight of his past mistakes remained, but the future, once a bleak and solitary landscape, was now blooming with possibilities. The aroma of freshly baked bread, a scent Liam insisted on learning, mingled with the faint scent of wood smoke from the fireplace Arthur had surprisingly allowed. Sunlight streamed through the vast windows of the playroom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Liam, sprawled on the floor amidst a chaotic landscape of building blocks, looked up, his eyes, the same startling blue as Arthur's, shining with mischief. "Daddy," he began, his voice still tinged with the cautiousness of a child unsure of new territory. Can we build a castle?" Arthur, perched on a low stool, carefully examining a miniature replica of the Blackwood building, felt a warmth spread through him. The meticulous detail of the model, usually a source of quiet satisfaction, seemed insignificant compared to the simple request. He swallowed, the familiar knot of guilt tightening in his chest. He had spent weeks avoiding the children's heartfelt efforts to connect, consumed by the looming shadow of his fractured marriage. "Of course, Liam," he replied, his voice softer than he intended. He pushed aside the model, the sleek lines and precise angles feeling cold and distant in comparison to the warmth radiating from his son. "What kind of castle?" Maya, perched on a plush armchair, her dark curls framing a face that mirrored Chloe's delicate features, chimed in, "A pirate castle, with secret passages." Chloe, quiet and observant as always, nodded her agreement, her eyes, so like Eleanor's, reflecting a cautious hope. The three of them, a constellation of miniature Arthurs, each possessing their unique spark, radiated an energy that filled the vast room. The once sterile environment was now alive with their laughter, their arguments over the placement of turrets, their shared dreams of adventure. Arthur watched them, a silent observer at first, then an increasingly engaged participant. He found himself laughing at Liam's silly pronouncements, helping Maya with her intricate drawings, and patiently listening to Chloe's quiet observations. The weight of his past mistakes still pressed upon him, the unresolved conflict with Eleanor a looming presence, but in that moment, surrounded by the warmth and chaos of his children, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile seed of peace taking root in the fertile soil of his hardened heart. The castle, a symbol of their newfound connection, rose slowly, brick by brick, a testament to a future he was determined to build, not of cold steel and glass, but of love, laughter, and the enduring strength of family. The solicitor's words hung in the air, heavy with legal jargon but light with the weight of a profound change. "The settlement, it's finalized. Everything is in their names now." Eleanor stared out the rain-lashed window, the city lights blurring into a shimmering, indistinct mass. The rain mirrored the torrent of emotions within her: grief, betrayal, a nascent understanding. She had fought, raged, even considered leaving, but the image of those three children, their innocent eyes reflecting the depths of her husband's hidden past, had stayed with her. Arthur entered, his shoulders slumped, the usual crispness of his tailored suit softened by a weariness that etched itself deep into his lines. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid swirling like the uncertainty in his heart. He hadn't expected her to accept the settlement so readily. I didn't think you would," he mumbled, his voice raw with exhaustion. Eleanor turned, her gaze steady, surprisingly calm. "It's not about the money, Arthur. It's about them. And us." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I need time to understand." He approached her, his hand hesitant before resting gently on her shoulder. The touch, once calculated and distant, now held a tremor of vulnerability. "I know," he whispered, "and I'll give you that time, but I won't stop trying to make this right." The silence that followed wasn't strained, but filled with the unspoken weight of shared pain and the fragile hope of a rebuilding process. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the glass, a symphony of sorrow and cleansing, a soundtrack to the slow, arduous journey of reconciliation that lay before them. The city lights, once a symbol of his self-made empire, now appeared as beacons guiding them towards an uncertain, yet possibly brighter future. The scent of old leather from his favorite armchair mingled with the subtle perfume Eleanor always wore, a reminder of the enduring strength of their bond, a bond tested but not broken. The children, their future secured, were the anchor in the storm, a symbol of a new legacy taking shape, one built not on wealth and power, but on love, forgiveness, and the shared responsibility of a family reborn. The following morning, sunlight, weak but persistent, filtered through the gauzy curtains of Eleanor's bedroom. She lay curled on her side, the crisp cotton sheets a stark contrast to the turmoil within. The city sounds, a distant siren wail, the rumble of a passing bus, seemed muted, filtered through a haze of sleeplessness and uncertainty. Arthur's touch, lingering like a ghost on her shoulder, replayed in her mind. It hadn't been the practiced gesture of a cold businessman, but a hesitant, vulnerable plea. She rose slowly, the silk robe cool against her skin. Descending the grand staircase, she paused, noticing a half-finished cup of coffee on the antique table. It was Arthur's, a familiar brand he insisted on, its bitter aroma usually unappealing to her. Today, though, the scent was oddly comforting, a trace of his presence, a tangible link to the man she'd known, the man she was struggling to understand. Later, in the sun-drenched conservatory, she found him. He sat amidst the towering ferns and exotic blooms, a newspaper abandoned on the marble table beside him. He wasn't reading, but staring out at the manicured lawns, his profile etched with a weariness that went beyond fatigue. The crispness of his suit was gone, replaced by the rumpled casualness of a man grappling with an upheaval far greater than any business deal. "Good morning," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He turned, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Eleanor," he replied, his voice a low murmur. He pushed himself up, the movement stiff and hesitant, like an aging oak struggling against a sudden storm. A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of a truth that had shattered their meticulously constructed world. The scent of lilies and jasmine hung in the air, a delicate perfume barely concealing the harsh reality that lay between them. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. "About the children." Arthur nodded, his gaze fixed on a distant point in the garden. "Me too." His voice cracked slightly. The carefully constructed barriers were crumbling, revealing a man stripped bare by the weight of his revelation. His carefully curated life, his flawless image, were suddenly meaningless, insignificant next to this unexpected truth. The weight of his deception, the profound responsibility he now bore, had softened the hard edges of his persona. "They deserve a chance," Eleanor continued. The fragile hope in her voice echoed the nascent understanding that's slowly taking root within her. It wasn't about the money or her shattered self-image. It was about 3 innocent children, their lives unexpectedly interwoven with theirs. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile beginning to a shared journey of acceptance. The orphanage's worn wooden swing set creaked a melancholic tune in the afternoon breeze. Liam, Maya, and Chloe, nestled amongst its faded paint, looked up as Arthur approached. The sun, sinking towards the horizon, cast long shadows, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple. Liam, ever the bold one, grinned, a gap-toothed smile that mirrored Arthur's own as a child. Maya, quieter, clutched a worn doll, her eyes, the same shade of hazel as Arthur's, reflecting a cautious hope. Chloe, the youngest, simply watched, her small hand reaching for Arthur's outstretched one, a hesitant touch that sent a jolt through him. "So," Arthur began, his voice rougher than he intended, "how was school?" Liam, ever the chatterbox, launched into a detailed account of his day, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness. Maya spoke less, but her eyes sparkled when she mentioned her favorite teacher. Chloe, usually shy, giggled at Liam's antics, her laughter surprisingly infectious. Arthur found himself listening, truly listening, not just hearing the words, but feeling the warmth of their presence, the vibrant energy of their young lives. The sterile, clinical atmosphere of his own home felt miles away. A shared silence fell as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched and distorted the playground. The children's faces, illuminated by the fading light, held a poignant mixture of weariness and resilience. A profound sense of connection washed over Arthur, heavy and bittersweet, confirming the bond that DNA had already revealed. This wasn't just a biological connection. It was a profound, undeniable truth. He was their father. The weight of that realization settled upon him, a burden and a blessing all at once. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a powerful emotion unfamiliar yet utterly compelling. "It's getting late," Arthur said, his voice still rough, but with a newfound gentleness. "We should go inside." As he helped Chloe down from the swing, her small hand nestled securely in his, he felt a profound shift within himself. He was no longer just Arthur Blackwood, the CEO. He was a father. The news spread like wildfire. Whispers in boardrooms, headlines screaming across newspapers, and a tsunami of online chatter. Arthur Blackwood, the unyielding titan of industry, was not just a powerful CEO, but the father of 3 children from a St. Jude's orphanage. The polished veneer of his public image cracked, revealing the raw, unsettling truth beneath. His meticulously crafted life, built on ambition and control, was suddenly exposed to the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The initial shock gave way to a mixture of outrage and morbid fascination. Some sympathized, others condemned. His business empire, built on ruthless efficiency and calculated risk, teetered precariously. Stock prices plummeted, deals crumbled, and the whispers of a hostile takeover intensified. Eleanor, initially devastated by the betrayal, found a strange resilience amidst the chaos. The public storm raged around them, but in the quiet moments, a new understanding blossomed. She saw Arthur, stripped bare of his usual armor, grappling with his newfound responsibilities. The man she'd married, distant and emotionally unavailable, was replaced by someone who was learning to love, to be vulnerable. It was messy, painful, and far from perfect, yet it was real. Arthur, facing the wreckage of his public life, found solace in the simple, unfiltered love of his children. Liam, Maya, and Chloe were his refuge, his grounding force in the storm. He learned to navigate the complexities of fatherhood, attending school plays, reading bedtime stories, and even struggling through clumsy attempts at braiding Maya's hair. One evening, huddled around a crackling fireplace in his now less imposing home, Arthur watched Liam meticulously assemble a model car, his brow furrowed in concentration. The boy's quiet focus, his determined grip on the tiny tools, reflected Arthur's own dedication to building his empire. Only now, the building blocks were different. They were made of love, laughter, and the unwavering resilience of 3 extraordinary children. A profound sense of peace settled over him, replacing the gnawing loneliness that had haunted him for so long. He was no longer merely a man of power. He was a father, a husband, finding purpose and fulfillment beyond the confines of wealth and corporate ambition. The legacy he was building now was far more precious than any boardroom victory. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of whispered anxieties. Arthur sat stiffly, the mahogany of the judge's bench reflecting in his usually steely eyes, now softened with a weariness that went beyond fatigue. Eleanor, her hand resting lightly on his, offered a silent reassurance, her own expression a mask of controlled composure. The air hung thick with the scent of expensive perfume and nervous sweat. The lawyer's voice, a monotonous drone, detailed the legal complexities of custody arrangements. It felt surreal, this formalized battle over his own children. Liam, Maya, and Chloe sat quietly in the front row, their small hands clasped together. Their faces, though still bearing the innocent charm that had first captivated Arthur, held a newfound gravity, a subtle understanding of the weight of the proceedings. Arthur caught Chloe's eye. She offered a small, brave smile, a silent message of unwavering support. A lump formed in his throat. The court finds in favor of joint custody. The judge's voice cut through the tension, its finality echoing in the hushed silence. A wave of relief washed over Arthur, so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent thanks for her unwavering strength throughout the ordeal. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of their home, the children clustered around him, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the evening lamp. The air hummed with a quiet, unspoken happiness. Liam, ever the pragmatist, asked about the business implications, a surprising display of maturity. Maya, her eyes sparkling with mischief, confessed her nervousness about sharing a room with Chloe. Chloe, the quiet observer, simply nestled closer to her father, a comforting weight against his side. Arthur looked at them, at the tangled limbs and shared smiles, and a profound sense of belonging settled over him. The legal battles, the public scrutiny, the upheaval of his life, it all faded into insignificance. This, he realized, was his new legacy, forged not in boardrooms and stock markets, but in the shared laughter and quiet moments of a family finally whole. The future held challenges, yes, but it also promised a journey of shared growth, love, and a legacy built not on wealth, but on the unwavering bonds of family. The scent of wood smoke and simmering stew hung heavy in the air as Arthur knelt beside Liam, helping him build a miniature castle from twigs and pebbles. The orphanage garden, once a bleak expanse, now bloomed with riotous color thanks to Arthur's quiet investment. Liam, usually reserved, chattered excitedly about siege tactics, his eyes bright with concentration. Arthur felt a warmth spread through him, a stark contrast to the icy reserve he'd worn for so long. This wasn't just charity. It was connection. "Papa," Liam said, the word tumbling out unexpectedly. "Maya says you're good at chess." Arthur smiled, the sound a little rusty from disuse. "Your sister's right. We could have a game sometime." The thought of teaching his son chess, a game he himself had mastered years ago as a solitary pursuit, filled him with an unfamiliar joy. Later, in the hushed quiet of his own study, Eleanor sat across from him, a cup of chamomile tea steaming in her hand. The tension between them, once a palpable force, had begun to ease. "I've been thinking," Eleanor began, her voice soft, "about the children's education." It was a simple sentence, yet it held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, a testament to her slow, painstaking acceptance. "Of course," Arthur replied, his voice equally gentle. He reached across the polished mahogany desk, his hand covering hers. The touch wasn't possessive, but a quiet acknowledgement of their shared journey. "We'll find the best schools, the best tutors, whatever they need." He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not just his wife, but a woman who had faced unimaginable pain and emerged stronger, more compassionate. He saw the resilience, the quiet strength, and he saw the love that still flickered between them, waiting to be rekindled. The legal battles were behind them, but a different kind of fight had begun, a fight to build a new family, a new legacy, founded not on power and wealth, but on love and forgiveness. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but hand in hand, they would face it together. The future, once shrouded in uncertainty, was slowly, steadily, coming into focus. The boardroom, usually a stage for Arthur's steely pronouncements, felt strangely muted. The mahogany gleamed under the soft light, reflecting the strained silence. News of his paternity had broken, a carefully constructed dam collapsing under the weight of truth. Whispers, like insidious vines, snaked through the financial world. His reputation, once untouchable, was under siege. Arthur, usually impeccably composed, felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He traced a pattern on the polished table, his gaze fixed on a single swirling grain. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. "How could you?" The pain in her voice, the raw betrayal, clawed at him. He met the gaze of his CEO, Marcus, a man whose loyalty felt as brittle as dried leaves. Marcus's expression was a careful blend of concern and calculation. "The market's reacting negatively, Mr. Blackwood." Arthur nodded, his throat dry. He knew the risks, the potential loss of control of his empire. But a different kind of empire was rising within him, a fragile fortress built on love and responsibility. He thought of Liam, Maya, and Chloe, their faces bright with a newfound hope. This newfound responsibility, while daunting, felt right. He looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes directly. "Inform the board that my priorities have shifted. Family comes first." The words were simple yet revolutionary. They signified more than a mere rearrangement of schedules. They represented a profound shift in values. The quiet strength in his voice surprised even him. He felt a stirring within, a new kind of resolve, not fueled by ambition, but by a love he hadn't known he possessed. The future, though uncertain, held a different kind of promise, one built not on power and wealth, but on the unshakable foundations of family. The weight of the world, once crushing, felt lighter, steadied by the weight of 3 small hands in his. The sprawling Blackwood estate, usually a monument to sterile elegance, felt different now. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a quiet testament to the recent upheaval. Arthur sat on the sun-drenched patio, Liam sketching furiously in a notebook beside him. The rhythmic scratching of pencil on paper punctuated the silence, a counterpoint to the turmoil that still simmered beneath the surface. "It's nice," Liam mumbled, not looking up. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his tongue poking out from the corner of his mouth. Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, softening the usually sharp lines of his face. "It is," he agreed softly. He watched Liam, the boy's focused intensity, a stark contrast to the nervous energy that had plagued him in the weeks since the revelation. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak tree, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Eleanor emerged from the French doors, a steaming mug in her hand. The apprehension that had once clouded her features had faded, replaced by a hesitant serenity. "Tea?" she offered, her voice quieter than usual. Arthur nodded, his gaze lingering on Eleanor. The weeks had been a crucible, forging a new bond between them, a bond tested by fire but strengthened by shared experience. The chasm that had separated them had begun to close, replaced by a tentative understanding. Liam looked up, his eyes bright. "Can I have some too?" Eleanor smiled, a genuine, warm smile that mirrored Arthur's. "Of course, sweetheart." The clinking of mugs, the soft murmur of conversation, the gentle sway of the oak tree, these simple sounds were the soundtrack to a new beginning.